The old farmhouse sat at the bottom of a shallow valley like something the land had slowly been trying to swallow for the past 100 years. The white paint had long since surrendered to the Iowa weather, peeling back in long curling strips to reveal the gray timber underneath. The front porch sagged on its left side where the support post had rotted clean through 2 winters ago, and nobody had gotten around to fixing it yet. The barn roof had a hole the size of a dining table, patched with a blue tarp that snapped and billowed in the October wind like a flag of defeat. 500 acres of some of the finest corn ground in Mahaska County, and the Ward family could barely keep the lights on. Riley Ward knew every inch of those 500 acres the way other 19-year-olds knew the layout of their college campuses. She knew which low-lying fields flooded first after a hard rain. She knew the 3 spots along the eastern fence line where the soil turned sandy and the corn always came in thin. She knew the narrow deer trails that cut through the timber, breaks the hidden drainage ditches that could swallow a tractor tire in the dark. The exact patch of ground near the old creek bed where her mother had liked to sit in the evenings and watch the light die over the fields. She knew the smell of the soil at each season, the iron-cold sharpness of it in late October, the way it turned rich and dark after spring thaw, the particular dry dustiness of a good harvest day when the combines were running and the air was full of chaff and the scent of cut stalks. Her mother had been gone 5 years now. Breast cancer quiet and relentless, the way bad things usually come in rural Iowa. It had taken Eleanor Ward in the spring of Riley's 14th year, and it had taken something out of Dale Ward that no amount of hard work or harvest season optimism had ever managed to replace. He still rose before dawn. He still drove the equipment and ran the accounts and showed up for every obligation the farm demanded. But the light behind his eyes had changed. It was still there, just dimmer now, like a pilot flame keeping a furnace barely running, doing just enough to prevent the whole system from going cold. Eleanor had been the one who held the temperature of the house. She had been the one who knew when Dale needed pushing and when he needed silence, who could read the particular set of his shoulders across a field and know whether the day had gone well or badly before he ever said a word. She had been the one who sat with Riley on the back porch in the evenings when the work was done and talked about nothing important in the way that makes everything feel stable. And Riley had not understood until she was gone how much of what felt like the world's ordinary weight had actually been held up by those conversations. Riley had stepped into the gap without being asked. That was simply what you did on a working farm when someone was gone and the land didn't care about your grief. At 14, she had learned to run the irrigation controls. At 15, she had learned basic engine repair. On the old John Deere had spent 3 weekends in the equipment shed with a manual and a set of wrenches until she could diagnose a fuel system problem by the sound of the engine turning over. By 17, she was negotiating corn prices at the grain elevator in town and holding her own against men 3 times her age, who initially smiled at her like she was playing pretend. They didn't smile like that anymore. Word had gotten around. The Ward girl knew what she was doing, and more importantly, she knew when someone was trying to take advantage of the fact that she was young and female and standing across the desk from a man who assumed those things were liabilities. They were not liabilities. They were information she used. She was built for this life in ways that had nothing to do with size or strength. She was lean and weather-hardened, her dark hair usually pulled back under a worn feed cap, her hands permanently carrying the faint shadow of grease and field dirt, no matter how hard she scrubbed them. She thought in straight lines. She solved problems the way her grandfather had taught her to sharpen a knife. Steady pressure, consistent angle, no wasted motion. She did not catastrophize, and she did not freeze, and she did not spend energy on emotions that didn't serve the immediate situation. People in Oskaloosa who didn't know her well sometimes mistook her quietness for shyness. People who did know her understood it was something else entirely. Riley Ward was quiet the way a well-built fence is quiet, solid, purposeful, holding things in place. Her grandfather Earl had been the one to teach her that. Earl Ward, who had farmed this ground for 40 years before arthritis, and then a bad heart had slowed him and finally stopped him 11 years ago. Earl, who had believed that a person's worth was entirely in what they did with the hours they were given, and not at all in what they said about what they planned to do. He had taught Riley to drive a tractor at 8 years old, standing her on the platform beside him so she could reach the controls, narrating every adjustment he made in the quiet, factual tone he used for everything. He had taught her to read weather, to read soil, to read the behavior of animals and machinery with the same patient attention. He had told her once when she was 9 years old and upset about something she could no longer remember, that most problems in life came down to one of two things. Either you were trying to fight something that couldn't be fought, in which case you needed to change your approach, or you were trying to avoid something that needed to be faced, in which case you needed to stop wasting time and face it. She had not fully understood it then. She had spent the subsequent 10 years learning what he meant. The debt was the thing that kept Dale awake at night and kept Riley working past dark on evenings like this one. $80,000 owed to First Mahaska Bank, the balance of a loan her grandfather had taken out to expand the operation back when interest rates were a nightmare and optimism about commodity prices had been running high. Earl had borrowed against the future with the confidence of a man who had always found a way to make the land produce. And for a while, the confidence had been justified. And then it hadn't been, and then Earl was gone, and the debt was Dale's problem. And then Eleanor was gone, and the debt was Dale's and Riley's problem. And it had been their problem for long enough now that the shape of it had become familiar. The way a chronic pain becomes familiar. They're always limiting something you managed rather than resolved. They had been chipping at it for a decade. The bank had been patient, the way banks are patient when they know they hold the only card that matters. But patient was not the same as forgiving, and the last letter from the loan officer had contained language that made Dale fold the paper in half before Riley could read the full page. She had read it anyway later alone in the kitchen after Dale had gone to bed. She had read it twice and then put it back in the envelope and set the envelope on the counter where Dale had left it and gone to bed herself. The numbers didn't lie. They were 2 missed payments away from a conversation that nobody in this family wanted to have, in which the bank would use words like restructuring and foreclosure, and the 500 acres that Earl Ward had spent his life building into something would begin the process of becoming someone else's problem. So on this particular Tuesday evening in the last week of October, while Dale slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a man who had been running on too little rest for too many years, Riley was out in the dark at the far northeastern edge of the property, crouched beside the number 3 irrigation pump with a flashlight clamped between her teeth and a pipe wrench in her hands. The pump had been throwing an error code for 3 days. She had been putting off the repair because the days kept filling up with more urgent problems, the way days on a working farm always do. There was always something that needed to happen today, and the thing that needed to happen tomorrow kept getting pushed back until it became the thing that needed to happen today. But the weather forecast called for a dry stretch starting Thursday, and she needed this pump running before the soil moisture dropped any further in the fields that were going to carry cover crop seed into the winter ground. The October night was cold enough that her breath came in small, visible clouds. The corn in this section had been harvested 2 weeks ago, the stalks cut down to shin height, but the field just north of the irrigation lane was still standing, a neighboring parcel. She had no jurisdiction over the stalks, tall and dense and black in the darkness, rustling softly in the wind like something breathing. The county road ran along the far edge of that standing field, maybe 200 yards from where she knelt. Out here you could hear a car coming from half a mile away on a still night. On most nights you might hear 3 or 4 vehicles over the course of a whole evening. Mostly trucks, mostly people who lived out this way and knew these roads and drove them without thinking. She heard the first sound at 11:17 by the watch on her wrist, which she checked because she made a habit of noting the time when anything out of the ordinary happened. A habit she had developed from years of keeping maintenance logs on the equipment. Not a car engine, not the slow roll of a truck over gravel. What she heard was something going wrong at high speed. A tire blowing. The percussive bang of it sharp and definitive. Then the immediate shriek of rubber on asphalt. Then the grinding lurch of a heavy vehicle losing control and the deep scrape of an undercarriage meeting the embankment. The crash itself was not dramatic the way crashes are in movies. It was a single heavy thump, the sound of mass meeting resistance at the end of its options, followed by a hissing silence that the night quickly filled back in with its ordinary sounds. Riley pulled the flashlight from between her teeth. She did not move immediately. She crouched lower instead, her body making a decision slightly ahead of her conscious mind, the same instinct that made her stop and listen before opening a gate she didn't recognize, before entering a space she hadn't cleared. She killed the small work light she had propped against the pump housing, plunging the immediate area into complete darkness. Then she waited, listening. Doors, two of them opening and closing in quick succession. Voices, male, low and agitated, carrying clearly across the flat ground in the cold air. She couldn't make out words yet, but the tone was wrong. Not the confused, slightly embarrassed tone of two men who had just run off the road and were assessing the damage and thinking about who to call. This was something more urgent than that, more controlled. The kind of voices that were keeping themselves quiet on purpose because quiet was operationally important to them. Riley moved. She did not use the flashlight. She crossed the harvested field in a low crouch using the cut stalks for cover where there was any moving toward the standing corn at the northern edge of the parcel. She slipped into the tall rows as cleanly as a fish entering deep water, the stalks closing behind her without sound. From inside the standing corn 30 yards from the road's edge, she could see the county highway clearly through gaps in the dense growth. A dark blue Lincoln Town Car had gone into the ditch at an aggressive angle, its front right corner buried deep in the soft embankment, the passenger side headlight pointing uselessly at the sky. The driver's side headlight was still working, throwing a long wedge of pale light across the gravel shoulder that illuminated the scene with the harsh clarity of something caught mid-action. Two men had gotten out. The one nearer to her was heavy-set, maybe 240 pounds, wearing a dark jacket too light for the October weather. He had a phone in one hand and was typing with the aggressive thumb movements of someone sending a message that needed to go right now, that could not wait for a better moment. The other man was taller, thin, in the angular way of someone who stays lean through constant motion, rather than discipline, moving to the rear of the vehicle with the purposeful economy of someone executing a step in a plan. The tall man opened the trunk. Riley stopped breathing. He reached in with both arms and pulled a person out onto the gravel. Not gently, not with any consideration for the weight and fragility of a human body. The kind of motion you use when the thing you are moving is cargo, when the only relevant quality is its position and not its condition. The person who came out of that trunk was a woman, older, silver-haired, her wrists bound behind her back with heavy zip ties, and her mouth covered with a wide strip of silver duct tape. She was wearing a leather vest over a flannel shirt, heavy boots, jeans, practically dressed for someone who spent time outdoors and expected to. Despite having just spent an unknown amount of time folded into a car trunk in the cold October night, she came out fighting. Her first move was a vicious backward heel kick that caught the tall man square across the shin. Her second was a shoulder twist that nearly broke his grip on her arm, a move that suggested she had been thinking about it for the entire duration of the ride and had been waiting for the moment when her feet would be on solid ground. The heavy-set man looked up from his phone. He crossed to the woman in 3 fast strides and spoke to her in a low, hard voice that carried the flat authority of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed and was annoyed that he was being required to demonstrate it. Then he hit her. An open-handed strike across the face, sharp and deliberate, not the wild swing of someone losing control, but the practiced motion of someone communicating a boundary, establishing the terms of an arrangement. The woman's head snapped to the side. She went down on one knee on the gravel, but she didn't go all the way down. She held herself there on one knee on the cold asphalt, breathing hard through her nose, and she looked up at the man who had hit her with an expression that Riley, even from 30 yards away and through the gaps in corn stalks, could read with complete clarity. Not fear, not submission, not the expression of someone calculating how to survive by making herself smaller. Pure ancient fury held inside iron discipline, the look of someone who has decided that the time for this particular accounting has not yet come, but is coming and will be remembered precisely. Riley heard the heavy-set man say something about a backup vehicle. She caught the word cartel delivered without particular care, the word of someone who wasn't worried about being overheard. She heard enough. She looked at the iron pipe wrench in her right hand. 18 inches of solid steel, the kind of tool that had been solving mechanical problems on this farm for 30 years. The kind of weight that conveyed its purpose without ambiguity. She thought about her ATV parked 200 yards behind her in the dark, and about the farmhouse a mile and a half away across the fields, and about the fact that her cell phone showed no bars out here, and hadn't since she'd ridden out at 9 o'clock. She thought about the woman on the gravel on one knee, not going all the way down. She thought about what happened when the backup vehicle arrived. Then Riley stopped thinking and started moving. She used the standing corn to circle wide around the parked car, working through the rows in near total silence. She had walked these fields in darkness hundreds of times, checking equipment, checking irrigation, moving through the property at all hours and all weathers, because a farm did not observe the same schedule that people preferred to observe. The stalks whispered against her jacket, and the dry leaves scraped at her forearms, but she barely registered it. She was focused entirely on the two men tracking their positions through the gaps in the corn, counting her steps, calculating angles, the way she had learned to do when navigating terrain in the dark by feel and by memory, and by the particular geometry of open spaces that develops in people who grow up moving through land in all conditions and learn to read it the way others learn to read rooms. She came around to the rear of the Lincoln. The heavy-set man was on the driver's side now, talking into his phone in a low, rapid voice. The tall man had the woman by the arm, forcing her upright, and was maneuvering her toward the shoulder of the road to wait for the vehicle that was apparently on its way. Riley emerged from the corn 8 feet behind the heavy-set man. She did not hesitate. She had learned from her grandfather at age 9, in a context that had nothing to do with violence. He had been explaining the proper way to end the suffering of an injured animal, and the lesson had been about commitment rather than cruelty. That hesitation in a decisive moment was the single most dangerous thing a person could introduce into an already dangerous situation. You made the decision. You committed. You did not revisit the decision once it was made, because the moment of revisiting was the moment when everything that needed to happen stopped happening. The wrench came down hard across the back of the man's right knee. She put her whole body into the swing, using her hips the way she had learned to use them, swinging a splitting maul on firewood rotation, weight transfer, follow through, letting the tool do the work it was designed to do. The sound was terrible, something structural giving way under sudden force. The man dropped instantly, his full weight going to the ground in a single collapsing motion, the phone flying from his hand and skidding across the asphalt into the gravel shoulder. The sound that came out of him started as a shout and compressed almost immediately into a low, breathless keening as the shock reached his nervous system and his body began the process of communicating the full extent of what had just happened to it. The tall man spun. His right hand went to his jacket. Riley was already moving. She dropped the wrench and covered the distance to him in 4 running steps and drove her shoulder into his ribs at full speed, the way she had once stopped a 300-pound boar that had gotten loose from a neighboring farm and come through her fence. The impact drove the air out of him completely and sent both of them down the embankment and into the blackberry scrub at the base of the drainage ditch. They hit the ground hard. Riley took the impact on her shoulder and rolled with it, coming up on her feet. The man took it on his back and struggled, the wind gone from him, his hands scrabbling in the dirt. She was on her feet first. She scooped up a fistful of loose gravel and dirt from the base of the ditch and threw it directly into his face. Not a gesture, a tactic, then turned and scrambled back up the embankment before he could recover his vision or his breath. The heavy-set man was on the ground trying to pull himself upright with one arm, his leg refusing to participate in any weight-bearing activity whatsoever. She could see the gun now, a heavy revolver silver, lying on the gravel 6 feet from his reaching hand. She crossed to it in 2 steps and kicked it off the shoulder and deep into the standing corn. It landed somewhere in the rows with a soft crash of dead leaves and disappeared. Then she was beside the woman, gripping her arm. "Come on," she said. "Right now." The woman found her feet faster than Riley expected, moving with the purposeful efficiency of someone who has been waiting for exactly this opportunity and had a plan for what to do with it. They were moving into the corn before the tall man had fully crested the embankment behind them. Riley ran. She ran the way you run when you know the terrain with your eyes closed, which she essentially did. The cutstalk field was rough going in the dark, but she knew the drainage pattern, knew where the ground was firm, and where it gave knew the subtle contours of a field she had walked and driven and worked since childhood. She pulled the woman along by the elbow and did not slow down until she could hear nothing behind them but wind and the rustle of standing corn, and distantly, the sound of a second vehicle turning onto the county road. She found the ATV by memory and touch knew exactly where she had left it. Could have found it in complete darkness without the faint moonlight that filtered through the October cloud cover. She pulled her hunting knife from its sheath on her belt and cut through the zip ties at the woman's wrists. With two careful strokes, the blade sharp enough that the plastic parted cleanly without requiring any sawing that might have cut skin. Then she gripped the edge of the duct tape at the woman's cheek and looked at her in the darkness. The woman's eyes were steady. She nodded once, a small, precise motion. Riley pulled the tape free in a single clean motion. The sound the woman made when her mouth was finally open was not a gasp or a sob or any of the sounds Riley might have expected from someone who had been in the back of a trunk. It was a controlled exhale, the breath of someone who had been holding their composure at a specific cost and was now spending the smallest possible amount of it. She straightened her back. She rolled her wrist carefully, assessing the damage from the zip ties. She looked at Riley in the darkness with an expression that was not gratitude, not yet. It was something more fundamental than that. Assessment. The focused, calibrating attention of someone taking inventory of a new situation. "Start the engine," the woman said. Her voice was low and unhurried and carried a quality of compressed authority, like the voice of someone who had been giving instructions in difficult circumstances for a very long time and had distilled the practice down to its essential elements. No wasted syllables, no inflation of urgency, just information that needed to be conveyed and was being conveyed. Because the men who sent those two are going to turn this entire county inside out looking for me. And the backup vehicle is already on that road. Riley started the engine. She ran the ATV back to the farmhouse with the headlights off, navigating by the pale sliver of moon and by the feel of familiar ground beneath the tires, the thousand small sensory cues of terrain she had been reading since before she could articulate what reading terrain meant. The woman rode behind her without holding on, sitting straight and balanced, riding by instinct the way someone rides who has spent a great deal of time on machines and has long since stopped thinking about the mechanics of balance. Neither of them spoke during the ride. Dale Ward was standing in the kitchen in his work boots and boxers with his 12-gauge shotgun when they came through the back door. He had heard the ATV on its approach and had done what any man raised rural and alone in a farmhouse 3 miles from the nearest neighbor would do. When something approached in the middle of the night unannounced, he had gotten up and gotten the gun and positioned himself where he could see the door and had stood there with the patience of a man who intended to wait as long as necessary to understand what he was dealing with. Riley told him quickly. She had always communicated this way when speed and clarity were both required, the facts in order, nothing added that didn't serve understanding, nothing left out that did. Cartel, 2 men, kidnapping, County Road 9, backup vehicle incoming. She held up her hand so he could see the grease and road dirt and the small cuts along her forearms from the blackberry scrub. Dale looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked at the woman standing in his kitchen at the raw red marks on her wrists, the cut on her forehead that was still seeping steadily, the leather vest with its specific emblem that he couldn't quite make out in the kitchen light. His face went through the rapid internal calculation of a man who has encountered something far outside his experience and is deciding in real time how to respond to it. He pulled a kitchen chair out from the table without a word and positioned it in the center of the room. He went to the cabinet above the refrigerator where Eleanor had kept the first aid kit for the last 20 years of her life, and it was still there because Dale Ward was not a man who moved things from where the people he loved had put them. "I'm calling Sheriff Pruitt," Dale said, reaching for the wall-mounted landline. The practical solution, the obvious solution, the solution that any sensible person in Mahaska County would reach for in a crisis. The woman's hand came out and caught his wrist. Her grip was extraordinary, not aggressive, but absolute, the grip of someone who has spent decades communicating her intentions through physical contact and who understood perfectly the difference between force and certainty. Dale stopped and looked at her. "Not the sheriff," she said. Her voice was even and quiet. "The men who took me knew exactly where I would be today and exactly what route I would take from the cemetery to get back to my motel. That information was not public. I told 2 people my plans. One of them has been dead for 3 years." She paused to let that arrive fully. "The other one is someone in local law enforcement." Dale stood very still with the phone receiver in his hand, looking at this woman in his kitchen, who had just told him that calling the sheriff might be the last thing any of them did. The woman released his wrist and held his gaze steadily. "I need to make one phone call," she said. "After that, we wait. Can you do that?" Dale looked at his daughter. Riley gave him a single short nod. She had reached the same conclusion before they had come through the back door, had been waiting to see whether he would need to be argued with or would arrive at it himself. He put the phone back in the cradle. He handed the receiver to the woman. She dialed from memory. A long-distance number, area code 480. She dialed without looking at the phone, without hesitation, the number as automatic as breathing. It rang twice. "Colt," she said. "It's your mother. I'm in Iowa outside Oskaloosa. 2 cartel runners tried to box me on County Road 9. A farm girl broke me out." She listened for several seconds. Her expression did not change in any way that Riley could read. "I'm at the Ward Farm south of town off the county highway." She paused again. "Yes. Come soon." She hung up and set the receiver back in its cradle with the careful precision of someone who handles every object as if it matters. She turned and looked at Dale and Riley with the settled calm of someone who has set a large and reliable machine in motion and is now simply accounting for the time it will take to arrive. "My name is Colette Hargrove," she said. "Most people call me Ma." She reached into the inside pocket of her leather vest and produced a ring. Heavy silver worn smooth on the inner band from decades of wear, the metal shaped around the particular width of the finger it had spent those decades on. Set into the face of it was an enameled emblem that both Riley and Dale recognized immediately, even though neither of them had ever seen one in person outside of a television screen. A winged skull wearing a motorcycle helmet. The death's head of the Hells Angels. "I'm from the Cave Creek Charter." Colette continued, sliding the ring onto the middle finger of her right hand with the practiced motion of something done 10,000 times before. "I came up to Iowa to visit my sister's grave. She passed last spring." There was a pause that contained everything that wasn't going to be said about that. "I was on my way back to the motel when they took me." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. The wind pressed against the loose window frame above the sink. The refrigerator motor cycled on with its familiar mechanical sound. "Who is Colt?" Riley asked. "My son," Colette said. "He is the president of the Midwest faction." She said it the way someone states a fact that is simply a fact, no pride in it, no apology for it, just information. Like saying the sky is clear or the crop came in well. Just the truth about what was true. Dale Ward sat down in the chair across from her. He set the shotgun across his knees and rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man recalibrating. Riley remained standing. She was watching Colette with the same focused, evaluating attention she gave to anything she was trying to understand from the outside. In the same look she gave a piece of machinery that was behaving in a way she hadn't seen before and needed to understand before she touched it. "How many men is he bringing?" Riley asked. Colette looked at her. Something moved in her expression, a slight sharpening of the quality of her attention, as if she had said something that landed in a particular place. "Enough," Colette said. The night stretched long and cold and sleepless in the way that nights stretch when danger is present, but not immediate, when the threat is real but not yet arrived, when there is nothing to do but maintain vigilance and wait. Riley sat in the chair by the front window with her grandfather's rifle across her lap, watching the driveway and the county road beyond it. Dale took the back of the house, sitting at the kitchen table with his shotgun and a mug of coffee that went cold without being finished. Every gust of wind that hit the loose siding sounded in the first fraction of a second like something it wasn't. Colette slept on the living room sofa. Genuinely slept, her breathing slow and even. Her battered face relaxed in a way it hadn't been while she was awake. The ring on her right hand caught the thin light from the kitchen and held it. Riley watched her sleep during the intervals between watching the driveway and thought about the specific kind of life that produced a person who could close their eyes in a stranger's house in the middle of a night like this one and simply rest. It was not the sleep of someone who had given up or gone numb to danger. It was the sleep of someone who had made all the decisions available to her, had set the machinery in motion, and understood that there was nothing further for her to do until morning. She had allocated her resources correctly and was now conserving them. Riley found it one of the more remarkable things she had seen in a life that had been teaching her things about what people were capable of since she was 14 years old. Around 2 in the morning in the deep dead stretch when the wind had temporarily quieted and the night was at its most absolute, Colette spoke without opening her eyes. "You didn't run," Colette said. Riley looked over from the window chair. "When you saw what was happening on that road," Colette continued, her voice low and even in the darkness, "you didn't run and you didn't freeze. You thought about it and then you acted." She paused. "Most people have the impulse. They feel it the same as you felt it. And then they find the reason why the impulse isn't practical, why it's too dangerous, why someone else should handle it, and they let it go." She finally opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling. "You did not let it go." Riley was quiet for a moment. Then it didn't feel like a choice. "That's exactly what I mean," Colette said. She turned her head and looked at Riley directly, and in the thin light from the kitchen, her eyes were very clear. "How old are you?" 19. Colette held her gaze for a long moment. Then she closed her eyes again. "You should sleep," she said. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day." Riley turned back to the window. She did not sleep. At 4 in the morning, Dale brewed a fresh pot of coffee without being asked, the practical gesture of a man who understood that the night wasn't ending and that people needed to be functional. He brought a mug to each of them. He and Riley traded positions for a while, him at the front window, her on the back porch in the cold, watching the fields. She stood out there in the October dark and breathed the cold air and thought about the woman sleeping on the living room sofa and the phone call she had made and the word enough. At 5:15, the sky began to shift from black to the deep anonymous gray of an Iowa pre-dawn, and Riley was standing on the back porch watching the change happen over the bare harvested fields and the distant tree lines and the low hills to the east when she felt it. Not heard. Felt. A vibration in the floorboards beneath her boots. Subtle at first, at the very edge of perception, like the deep foundation hum of something enormous running very far away. The coffee mug trembled slightly in her hand. The water in the dog bowl on the bottom porch step sent tiny circular ripples outward from some invisible disturbance. Dale appeared in the doorway. "Do you feel that?" "Ew." The vibration deepened. What had been a barely perceptible sensation became a sound that separated itself from the ambient quiet of the morning. The way a river's roar separates itself from rain as you approach it, by gaining definition, by acquiring layers, by insisting on being understood as a specific thing it was. Low rhythmic, synchronized. Not one engine. An impossible number of engines all running in the same rhythm. The sound of a mechanical force of immense size moving across the flat Iowa land toward them. Riley walked around to the front of the house. She could see the hill to the north from the front porch, the long, gradual rise of ground that County Road 9 crested before descending toward the valley, where the Ward farm sat at the bottom. The sky above the hill was still that deep pre-dawn gray, and the hilltop was dark against it. And then the hilltop was not dark because over its crest came headlights. Not 2, not 10, not 50. A river of headlights pouring over the hill in a continuous stream. 2 abreast, perfectly spaced with the discipline of long practice, rolling down the long grade toward the farm in a formation that stretched back over the crest of the hill as far as she could see and showed no sign of ending. The sound had become something you experienced with your whole body now, rather than simply heard a chest-deep resonance that pressed against the ribs from the inside and hummed in the back teeth and made the loose panes in the farmhouse windows vibrate in their frames and set the dog to a confusion of low, uncertain sounds she had never made before. They filled the driveway. They filled the front lawn. They rolled with remarkable discipline across the harvested fields to the east and south, parking in rows that spoke of men who had done exactly this before in other places, under other circumstances, and had long since developed the choreography for it. The headlights swept the front of the house and the barn and the old equipment shed in rotating arcs before winking out one by one as engines were cut. And with each engine that went silent, the overall roar dropped another note, but never fully died because there were still more coming over the hill. 2,000 men, all in leather, all patched, all wearing the red and white of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. They ranged in age from their mid-20s to their late 60s and covered every variation of build that men who live physical lives accumulate over decades. They sat on their machines with the particular posture of people who are exactly where they intended to be and have no uncertainty about it. The front porch steps creaked as Colette walked out past Riley and stood at the top of them, looking out over the assembled mass of riders with the expression of a woman surveying something that belongs to her, not possessively, but with the particular ease of familiarity. The way you look at your own kitchen, your own fields, the faces of people you have known for a long time and trust completely. From the head of the column, a single large motorcycle rolled forward and stopped at the base of the porch steps. The engine cut out. The rider dismounted. He was very large, 6'4" wide through the shoulders, in the way of a man who has been physically strong for his entire adult life and has not allowed age to substantially renegotiate those terms. His forearms were covered in ink that had been accumulating for decades. His beard was silver and had been grown for years rather than months. He wore a leather cut with the president patch positioned over his left breast, with the permanence of something that had been there so long it had become part of the garment's identity. He moved with the deliberate economy of a man who has never needed to perform his size for anyone. He took off his sunglasses. His eyes were pale blue, the specific shade of pale blue that occurs in people who have spent a great deal of time looking at long distances. He looked at his mother on the porch. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment, conducting the particular conversation that parents and children who have survived difficult things together conduct without words or recognition in accounting. A brief and complete exchange of everything that didn't need to be said aloud. Then Colt Hargrove turned his eyes to Riley. He looked at her the way she had seen certain serious men look at things they were genuinely interested in, understanding not aggressive, not performative, just direct and thorough the attention of someone who is actually gathering information and not just going through the motions of it. She returned the look without flinching. She was still holding the coffee mug. Her hair was windblown from the back porch. Her jacket was torn at the left elbow from the blackberry scrub, and she had not slept. Colt climbed the 3 porch steps. He was very close now and very large, and the combined attention of 2,000 men behind him was a physical weight in the air, a pressure that she registered without being certain how she was registering it. He stopped in front of Riley Ward and looked at her for a long, complete moment in the early gray light. Then Colt Hargrove went down on one knee on the rotting porch boards. He bowed his head. He placed his right fist over the president patch on his chest, over his heart. Behind him, 2,000 men went absolutely silent. Not quiet the way a crowd goes quiet when asked. Silent the way a held breath is silent, with the specific quality of chosen stillness of 2,000 individual decisions arriving at the same place simultaneously. "You pulled my mother out of the trunk of a car," Colt said. His voice was low and carried in the stillness without being raised. With a pipe wrench and a pocket knife in the dark, alone with no backup and no plan beyond the moment. He looked up at Riley. His eyes were steady and without performance. "My mother is my foundation. Everything I have built and everything I am was constructed on what she gave up to raise me. You saved her life last night." He paused. "From this day forward, the Hells Angels owe you a debt that does not have a bottom. Whatever you need whenever you need it for the rest of your life, you call and we come. That is not a favor or a courtesy. That is a fact about how the world works from this point forward." He rose to his feet. He turned to face the 2,000 riders spread across the Ward farm in the pale Iowa morning, the fields beyond them bare and waiting. His voice did not need to be raised. "Brothers Colt," Hargrove said, "we have a cartel problem in Mahaska County, Iowa, and nobody goes home until it is resolved." The sound that came back from 2,000 men was not a cheer. It was lower than that and heavier and less structured, a collective sound of assent that seemed to come from somewhere below the register of ordinary speech, from the same place as the engines that had carried them here across the dark plains. It rolled across the Ward farm and out over the bare fields and faded into the gray October morning like the last echo of something large passing through. Riley Ward stood on the sagging porch of her family's failing farm in her torn jacket and her worn boots, holding a coffee mug that had gone cold an hour ago. She was 19 years old. She had not slept. Her hands still carried the memory of the pipe wrench. She did not feel small. The Ward farmhouse kitchen had never held this many people at once. It had been built for a family, for the ordinary scale of people who live and work together on a piece of land, and it communicated its limitations clearly now, with 12 large men pressed against the walls and crowded along the counters, while Colt Hargrove stood at the head of the oak table with a topographic map of Mahaska County spread flat beneath his ring-covered hands. The overhead light threw hard shadows across faces that had collectively accumulated more experience than Riley could easily calculate. The smell of coffee and leather and cold morning air had saturated the room completely. Outside, 2,000 men had established a perimeter with the efficiency of people for whom this kind of deployment was not theoretical. Riley had watched it happen through the window in the 40 minutes since Colt had spoken from the porch. The quiet, unremarkable way the riders had organized themselves without visible instruction, moving to positions that needed to be covered, as if the positions were obvious, which for them, apparently they were. Access roads blocked. The tree line along the eastern boundary occupied. A fuel truck that had materialized from somewhere down the county road was running a quiet operation near the equipment shed. A supply truck had positioned itself near the barn and was distributing coffee and water with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a logistics operation that had been run before. Dale stood in the corner of the kitchen with his shotgun leaning against the wall beside him, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the proceedings with the expression of a man who has decided that the most useful contribution he can make to a situation that has completely exceeded his frame of reference is to remain still and pay very careful attention to everything that is happening. He was doing that with a discipline Riley recognized and appreciated. Her father was many things, but he was not a man who spent energy on reactions that didn't serve any practical purpose. Colette sat in the chair by the window with a fresh mug of black coffee, her cut and bruised face cleaned and dressed with gauze from the first aid kit, her posture in the chair suggesting someone who was resting by choice rather than necessity. She had not been asked to leave the room. The suggestion would not have been made. Briggs Calloway stood against the refrigerator with his arms crossed and his eyes in constant quiet motion around the room. He was the kind of man whose silence was not absence, but presence. He communicated more by being there than most people communicated by talking. He had heavy sloping shoulders and a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw, earned somewhere in a history he didn't discuss. And his baseline alertness was permanently set several degrees higher than the civilian norm. Rook occupied the doorway to the hallway with the complete physical authority of a man who is 6 inches taller than the doorframe was designed to accommodate, and has long since made peace with that. He moved with an odd, deliberate lightness, the careful motion of someone who had spent years learning to exist in spaces that weren't built for him without breaking things. He said nothing during the entire council. When it concluded and the men began moving, he would be the first one through the door, not urgently, just first, the way a man moves when he already knows what needs doing. Colt had the map. He was looking at it the way Riley looked at equipment that was behaving in an unexpected way, not frustrated, not impatient, but with the focused, methodical attention of someone searching for the specific place where understanding needed to begin. "Walk me through it," Colt said. He was speaking to Riley, not to Briggs, not to the lieutenants along the walls, to Riley specifically and deliberately. He had made that decision somewhere between the porch and the kitchen table and had not revisited it. "Everything you saw. Start where it started." Riley told it clean. Sequence detail, no editorializing, the same way she wrote maintenance logs on the farm equipment, what happened in order with the specific information that was actually relevant. The sound she heard at 11:17. The approach through the standing corn. The two men, their positions, their behavior. The Lincoln in the ditch. Colette in the trunk. The heavy-set man with the phone. The message he was sending with the urgency of someone whose timeline was not under his control. The word cartel delivered without any particular caution, which told her they hadn't expected to be overheard, which told her they had expected the road to be empty, which told her someone with knowledge of the area had told them it would be. When she finished, Colt was quiet for a moment that had weight to it. "The clay," he said. Riley had been waiting for someone to reach that. "When I went down the embankment after the tall man, she said I went into the ground at the base of the ditch." She held up her right hand, and even now after washing, there was a faint reddish cast in the creases of her knuckles that was distinct from the ordinary dark of engine grease. Not gray, not the black of topsoil. Red clay. That is not local soil. Everything in this county runs black topsoil or gray limestone gravel. The only red clay in a 40-mile radius is at one location. She moved to the map and put her finger on it without any hesitation at all. "Here. This is an abandoned limestone quarry on the Northern County line. It has been shut down for 16 years. The access roads washed out in the flooding of 2011 and were never repaired because there was no economic reason to repair them. It does not appear on any current GPS mapping because the database was never updated after the quarry closed. It sits on private land and it has not been actively managed or visited in years, which means someone has been using it without anyone noticing, because there was no one positioned to notice." Briggs Calloway uncrossed his arms. "Whose land?" Riley looked at her father. Dale came off the wall and joined them at the table. "The deed belongs to Wallace Pruitt," Dale said. "He's 83 years old and has been in a memory care facility in Des Moines for the past 4 years. He is not capable of managing property. His younger brother has been overseeing the estate by default and by the terms of the power of attorney." The kitchen went still, not the stillness of people processing new information, the stillness of people who have already processed it and are waiting for the thing that needs to be said to be said. "Sheriff Denton Pruitt," Riley said. Colt lifted his eyes from the map and looked at Colette. Colette set down her coffee mug. She had been waiting for this moment with the patience of someone who had known it was coming and had decided that it needed to arrive on its own schedule rather than being rushed. "I have known Denton Pruitt for 22 years, she said. Her voice was level and without heat, informational, not personal. 22 years ago, he was a deputy sheriff with significant gambling debts and a demonstrated willingness to look past certain things when it benefited him. The club helped him manage a situation that would otherwise have ended his career. We did that more than once over several years. In return, he provided information when it was needed and kept his jurisdiction's attention appropriately directed. That arrangement ended 6 years ago when he was elected sheriff and made the determination that the liability of the ongoing relationship outweighed its benefits." She paused. "He was correct about that. We let the arrangement end without consequence." She picked up her coffee mug again. "He knew I was coming to Iowa," she continued. "I called my niece Vera, my sister's daughter, to let her know I would be visiting the grave. Vera lives in Ames. She has a neighbor she trusts. That neighbor is married to Denton Pruitt's brother-in-law." She paused. He did not need to be told directly. He only needed to pass the information one step further to the right person. The gambling debts never stopped. They simply grew larger and changed creditors. Someone found those debts and purchased them, and with them purchased access to whatever Denton Pruitt knew that had value. The chain Colt said quietly. 6 links between my itinerary and a cartel logistics operation, Colette said. He didn't need to understand what he was selling. He only needed to sell it. Briggs said something under his breath that functioned as the room's collective editorial response. Colt's finger moved on the map to the northern county line to the mark Riley had made. How do we approach without using the main road? You can't use the main road, Riley said. Not with motorcycles. From 2 miles out in flat terrain, the sound carries clearly. They would have 20 minutes of warning and unlimited options for what to do with it. She studied the map for a moment, tracing a route she had walked and driven many times. There are logging trails that run through the timber breaks along the back of Sawyer Ridge. She traced the path with her finger, a route that stayed inside the tree line the entire way, and approached the quarry from the southwest, coming up behind the elevated rim, rather than down the access road into the bowl. It's narrow in places and washed out in a few spots. Not maintained. She paused. But I know every foot of it. I've been hunting that ridge since I was 12 years old, and I know where the trail holds and where it doesn't, and where you need to slow down. Colt looked at her. She met his gaze. She knew what he was going to say before he said it, and she had already built her response. You've done everything anyone could ask, Colt said. More than that, significantly. You should stay here with your father and let us handle what comes next. Riley shook her head once. A single motion that was not aggressive, not emotional, just definitive. He studied her. You said it on the porch, Riley said. Her voice was even and direct, carrying no more heat than a statement of observable fact requires. A debt with no bottom. Whatever I need whenever I need it. She let that sit for exactly one beat. I am using it now. This is my county. Those men were on my road in my field 30 feet from my family's property. I want to be present when this ends. I want to see it end. Colt was silent. He looked at Dale. Dale Ward looked at his daughter. The specific expression on his face was not one Riley could fully read in real time. It required processing she didn't have space for in that moment. It carried the weight of a man who had watched someone outgrow the role they occupied in his understanding of the world, and was now in a specific moment being required to formally acknowledge that revision. It was not quick. It was not simple. Then Dale looked at Colt Hargrove and gave a single small nod. Colt turned back to the map. Briggs, he said, pull the filthy few plus 200. Running dark, staggered departure 20-man intervals, 15 minutes between each group. No radio communication after we enter the timber. Briggs was already moving toward the door. Rook, Colt said without turning. Rook straightened from the door frame, said nothing, went. Riley, Colt said. She looked at him. You ride with me, you direct the route. Nothing else until I say otherwise. He paused. Understood, Riley nodded. That was acceptable. For now. The staging happened with a speed and economy that Riley found genuinely impressive at the scale involved. Within 40 minutes, while the bulk of the 2,000 riders maintained the perimeter at the Ward Farm under the command of Briggs's second, a strike force of just over 300 men had been assembled, equipped and positioned along the north end of the property. Their headlights had been taped, not covered taped, with a specific matte material that one of the supply trucks had produced, along with other equipment Riley consciously chose not to inventory. They would run on parking lights only until they entered the timber, and then nothing. Darkness and silence, and the navigation skills of the men involved. Dale was on the back porch as Riley pulled on her heavier jacket and checked the sheath on her hunting knife. He watched her work the buckle, and he did not say any of the things she could see sitting just behind his expression. Instead, he said, the back 40 needs the irrigation pressure checked when you get back. Riley looked up at him. Yeah, she said. I know. He put his hand on her shoulder and squeezed once, the particular grip of a man saying something he doesn't have a word for, and then let go. She went down the porch steps. Colette was standing at the corner of the house. Riley had not heard her come outside. You understand that what happens out there does not follow the rules that normally apply, Colette said quietly. She was not warning Riley away. She was providing information to someone who was about to operate in terrain they needed to be accurately prepared for. I understand, Riley said. Colette looked at her for a moment. The measuring quality of her attention had a new element in it now, something that had not been there in the cornfield, or in the kitchen, or on the porch. Riley couldn't immediately name it, but felt its presence as clearly as she had felt the vibration in the floorboards before the riders came over the hill. Then Colette reached into the inside pocket of her vest and pressed something into Riley's right hand and closed Riley's fingers around it. The silver ring, the death's head. Every man in that column has seen this ring since they were old enough to understand what it means, Colette said. Any one of them sees it on you, they will put themselves between you and whatever needs stopping. She paused. Don't lose it, and don't show it unless you need it. Riley looked down at her closed hand. Then she opened her jacket and slipped the ring into the breast pocket over her heart and buttoned the pocket closed. She walked to the head of the column where Colt's motorcycle was idling at a frequency so low it was almost below the threshold of hearing. She climbed on the back. Colt put the machine in gear without a word, and they moved north along the farm's service lane in near silence. And the column of darkened motorcycles fell in behind them, one group at a time, 200 yards between groups. The whole operation sliding into the dark with a quietness that seemed, given its scale, almost impossible. The logging trails were everything Riley had described, and nothing that could have been adequately described without having been there. Narrow, rough, demanding the kind of terrain that separates people who can ride from people who merely own motorcycles. The trails wound through stands of oak and hickory, crossed two creek beds that were still running from the October rains, and required careful line selection to cross without losing traction, and climbed the back of Sawyer Ridge through a section where the trail narrowed to 8 feet across, with a limestone face on one side and a 40-foot drop on the other. 300 motorcycles in near total darkness in formation navigating this terrain in stage groups. They navigated it, without incident, without noise. Riley directed Colt with taps on his shoulder, a simple vocabulary they established in the first quarter mile and never had to renegotiate. Left, right, slow, stop. He responded to each signal without hesitation, without verification, treating her guidance as the reliable data source it was. She had spent enough time directing other operators on equipment, combining operations irrigation work, the 1,000 coordination tasks of a working farm to know how to communicate through touch in the dark. And he had spent enough time operating in difficult conditions with people he trusted to know how to receive that communication and act on it cleanly. It took 45 minutes to cover 2.5 miles. Near the top of the ridge, where the timber thinned and the trail bent to follow the rim rock, Colt stopped the first group with a raised fist. They went the last 200 yards on foot, leaving the machines in the trees. Riley reached the rim first. The quarry below was a massive bowl carved into the bedrock of the ridge, circular and sheer-sided 400 yards across and dropping 60 feet to the floor. In daylight, it was an unremarkable industrial remnant, the kind of thing that accumulates quietly in rural landscapes and eventually becomes part of the background. In the darkness, under the harsh white wash of 4 portable halogen work lights positioned at the base of the old rock crusher, it was something entirely different. It was a working operation caught at the peak of its activity. 3 black SUVs were parked near the crusher. A heavy transport truck, unmarked its trailer backed up to the base of the crusher platform, was being loaded by 6 men moving heavy canvas duffel bags in a continuous relay. The careful, deliberate movement of people who understand the value and volatility of what they are handling. Near the SUVs, 2 men with rifles stood in the softened posture of security personnel who have been maintaining attention for long enough that the attention has begun to fray at the edges. 3 figures stood between the lead SUV and the crusher platform in what appeared to be a tense conversation. The heavy-set man from the Lincoln was there, his right leg immobilized, leaning on a steel crutch, still present despite everything that had happened to him in the last several hours. Beside him, in the posture of someone accustomed to command, was a man in a light-colored jacket, whose physical stillness was itself a form of communication. And between them, in his tan Mahaska County Sheriff's uniform, with his silver badge catching the work light, and his clipboard in his hand, was Denton Pruitt. Riley had seen Pruitt at community events over the years: the county fair, the 4-H auction, the harvest festival that Dale had taken her to every year when she was small and occasionally since. He was a tall man with a wide jaw and gray temples and a permanent slight squint that came from years of outdoor work. He had always struck her as the particular variety of small-town authority that sustains itself on deference, not violent, not obviously venal, just deeply accustomed to operating in a world where his position was never seriously questioned, and where that lack of friction had gradually convinced him that his position was the same as his character. He did not look like that now. He looked like a man who had made a calculation that seemed sound when viewed from a comfortable distance, and was only now at close range understanding the full nature of what he had miscalculated. He was gesturing with the clipboard in the sharp, compressed way of someone who is communicating urgency while keeping their voice below the level that would carry. Colt appeared at Riley's shoulder. He looked down into the quarry for a long moment, conducting his own assessment, then moved his attention to the gravel ramp that was the only vehicle access to the floor, curving up from the southwest corner of the pit to the rim road above. He looked at Briggs, who had come up behind them. Briggs looked at the ramp. He gave Colt a single nod. Colt looked at Riley. There was something in that look that Riley did not have precise language for. It was not a question about the operational situation which had been assessed and decided. It was an acknowledgement of her presence, of the chain of decisions that had led from a dark cornfield to this limestone rim, of the fact that what was about to happen was happening in part because a 19-year-old farm girl had refused to let go of an impulse that most people would have released. She gave him a nod. Colt raised the radio to his mouth. He spoke at normal conversational volume without urgency. "Light them up," he said. 300 headlights snapped on at the rim of the quarry simultaneously, every one of them angled downward, flooding the pit floor with a sudden blinding light that rendered the halogen work lamps irrelevant. In the exact same moment, 300 engines fired not in sequence, but together, a single massive detonation of sound that hit the limestone walls of the quarry and bounced and compressed and had nowhere to go but into the people standing below it. The effect was total and immediate. The two rifle-carrying men dropped to their knees before they had processed the decision to do so. The relay line of bag carriers stopped moving and stood frozen, suspended in the avalanche of light and sound. The man in the light jacket completed a full revolution, looking for the exit that the light was already telling him didn't exist. The heavy-set man on the crutch went down on one knee as his crutch slipped on the limestone. Pruitt dropped his clipboard. Briggs led 50 men down the ramp at a controlled jog, fanning wide as they descended, establishing a wall of bodies and chrome across the only exit before anyone on the quarry floor had finished processing what was happening to them. The remaining 250 remained at the rim headlights, aimed down silhouettes black against the pale pre-dawn sky, standing with the patient, immovable quality of men who have no urgency because the situation is already resolved. Colt walked down the ramp. He walked at his ordinary pace without drama, his boots crunching on the gravel with each step. He walked past Briggs and past the line of men at the base of the ramp and into the quarry floor as if he were entering a room in a building he owned. The cartel security men had their hands visible. Nobody had instructed them to raise them. Their bodies had simply made the only calculation available when surrounded by 300 armed men at every elevation and concluded that visible hands were the appropriate response. Riley came down the ramp behind Colt. She stopped at the edge of the work light's reach, close enough to observe everything, clearly maintaining the position she had agreed to maintain. Rook came down last. He moved through the quarry floor without apparent hurry, and within 10 minutes of the lights coming on, he had organized 4 men into a quiet, efficient binding detail that was working its way through the cartel crew with zip ties and professional thoroughness, removing weapons and securing wrists and ankles with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who had done this before and found nothing complicated about it. Colt stopped in front of Denton Pruitt. Pruitt was attempting to compose himself and not succeeding. The clipboard was still on the limestone at his feet where he had dropped it. His right hand had made an involuntary move toward his service weapon in the first seconds after the lights came on and had then retreated, and it didn't know where to go from there. "Sheriff Colt said." His voice was conversational, calibrated to the distance between them. I understand there have been some missing persons concerns in this county. Pruitt's jaw was tight. His eyes found Colette, who had come down the ramp behind Riley and was standing now at the edge of the light watching. The expression that crossed Pruitt's face when he saw her was a compressed sequence of reaction surprise, followed immediately by something that might have been relief, followed by shame, followed by the specific quality of calculation that a man applies when he is trying to determine whether there is still a play available to him and is arriving at the answer that there is not. Colt Pruitt said and stopped. He restarted. Listen to me, these people came to me 14 months ago. They had documentation. They had materials that would have ended my career and destroyed my family. I was not given a choice in any meaningful sense of the word. I provided one piece of information, one route, one time. Colt looked at him without expression. I want you to hear yourself, Colt said quietly. His voice did not change register or temperature. You are standing in a Mahaska County Sheriff's uniform in an active cartel staging operation beside 300 kilos of product going into an unmarked truck, telling me you had no choice. Pruitt's mouth opened and did not produce anything useful. Colt turned to the man in the light jacket, who had arranged himself into a careful stillness and was observing everything with the focused attention of someone who is running calculations on a situation that is not going in his direction and has not yet given up on finding the variable that changes the outcome. He was in his 50s, dark-haired, going gray, with the particular kind of maintained fitness that is not natural but is sustained. He had the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous presence in any room he occupied. He was not that in this room. You came a long way, Colt said. Brought a significant operation, made local arrangements at the law enforcement level. He paused. You made one mistake. You put the wrong woman in a trunk. The man's eyes moved once to the rim above, counting headlights, running arithmetic, arriving at a total he didn't find satisfactory. Drop the weapons, Colt said. All of them. On the limestone in front of you now. The sound of rifles and handguns being placed carefully on stone was deliberate and sequential. Nobody made a performance of resistance. The mathematics were what they were, and the men involved were professionals who understood mathematics. Colt looked at Briggs. Briggs moved toward the transport truck and reached for the trailer latch. Don't, Colt said without turning. Don't open it. Don't touch the product. Don't touch anything in this quarry that isn't already on the ground. Briggs stepped back. Colt reached into his vest and produced a cell phone. He pressed a contact and held it to his ear. One ring. It's Hargrove, he said. Northern Mahaska County, Iowa. Abandoned limestone quarry at the county line, half a mile east of Route 63. Active cartel transport operation, approximately 300 kilos of product, armed personnel in custody, and a county sheriff who facilitated the operation. The scene is contained. He listened for a moment. I'll be gone before you arrive. The product will still be here. He put the phone in his vest. Now Pruitt understood fully. His face completed its progression through the available expressions and settled into something that was less an expression than its absence. The face of a man who has seen the next several years of his life with complete clarity and has run out of ways to argue with what he sees. Pruitt had been watching the man in the light jacket. Something had been building behind his eyes over the past several minutes, not conscience, not courage, but the specific and escalating panic of a man who has realized that his only remaining leverage is the truth, and that using it is his last available move. He pulled himself upright. He lied to me, Pruitt said. His voice was unsteady. The arrangement was information only. No one was supposed to be harmed. He told me it was a financial dispute, an internal matter. He said the Hargrove woman would be questioned and released. The man in the light jacket looked at Pruitt with the flat patience of someone watching a predictable thing happen on a schedule they had anticipated. Pruitt's hand moved toward his service weapon. The gesture was not tactical. It was the gesture of a man whose body was trying to create an option that his mind couldn't find. Colt moved faster than his size should have allowed. His hand closed around Pruitt's wrist before the gun cleared the holster, and he held it there with the absolute certainty of someone who had made a decision and was simply executing it. Don't, Colt said. One word delivered at the same conversational volume as everything else. Pruitt's legs gave out. He sat down on the limestone without ceremony, not violently, but completely, the way a structure gives way when the load finally exceeds what it was built to carry. He sat with his back against the bumper of the nearest SUV, and he did not get up again. Rook moved past him to continue the binding detail. Colt looked at the man in the light jacket one final time. The product is theirs, Colt said. The sheriff is theirs. The documentation of how this arrangement was structured is going to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Des Moines by 8 o'clock this morning. The man in the light jacket held his gaze. You understand what this costs you. Colt's patience was absolute and had no visible bottom. I had arrangements in 14 counties that this operation has now ended, he said. That is the cost. You put my mother in a car trunk. He turned away. That's what it cost you. Tie them, he said to Rook as he passed. Wrists and ankles. Leave them mobile enough to be found. He glanced at Riley as he passed her, and something crossed his face, not a smile, not performed acknowledgement. The specific look of someone who has witnessed something that met a standard they had not expected to be met and is registering that fact. Come on, he said. Riley took one last look at the quarry floor. At Pruitt, sitting against the bumper with his hands in his lap, his badge still catching the light. At the transport truck, undisturbed, waiting for the people whose job it was to process what it contained. At the work lights, still burning in their positions, illuminating everything, leaving nothing in shadow. She turned and walked up the ramp. The ride back from the quarry was different from the ride out in every quality except the darkness. On the way out, 300 men had moved through the timber in deliberate silence, conserving everything attention, sound, light, energy. On the way back, the silence was of a different order. Resolved. The particular quiet of men who have completed something that needed completing and are now simply in motion toward the next thing, carrying the settled weight of finished work. Riley sat behind Colt on the long descent from Sawyer Ridge. The cold had deepened in the hours they had been out past the point of discomfort and into the blank numbness that the body produces when it has run out of easier options. She didn't comment on it. She watched the tree line open ahead of them as the trail widened and the timber thinned and the flat Iowa farmland came back into view in the darkness below, familiar and permanent in hers. She thought about her father. The thought had been present since the quarry floor patient and persistent waiting for the immediate operational requirements to clear enough space for it to be heard. Dale at the farmhouse alone with Colette and the skeleton crew that had remained on the property. She had run the security calculation before they left and had been satisfied with it. 20 men on the property access roads covered the perimeter maintained. She had been satisfied in the way that satisfies the head but not the chest. She thought about the GPS tracker that Briggs had found under the rear fender of her ATV 6 hours ago. They had removed it from the vehicle and left it transmitting from the equipment shed. Standard misdirection, Briggs had said practiced and matter-of-fact about it. Anyone monitoring the tracker signal would see it stationary at the farm and draw the conclusion that the ATV and whoever operated it was still there. She was thinking about that now more carefully than she had been able to think about it when there were operational priorities competing for her attention. The tracker had been placed sometime during the hours when 2,000 men were on the Ward property. Not by the quarry crew they had been at the quarry, someone else. A secondary layer of the operation working quietly around the edges of the primary, watching from a position outside the perimeter. She tapped Colt's shoulder, the signal for the left fork that would bring them back down the service lane to the farm rather than looping out to the county road. Colt took the fork. They came off the ridge and onto the service lane at 3:20 in the morning. The farm assembled itself ahead of them through the darkness in its familiar arrangement. The barn, the equipment shed the pale face of the farmhouse with its sagging porch. The motorcycles that had remained on the property were in their rows across the fields. The men at the access roads and fence lines were at their positions. Everything appeared as it should appear. Riley was off the motorcycle before it had fully stopped. Not urgency exactly, she couldn't have named what it was, couldn't have pointed to a specific thing that was wrong. Something in the composition of the scene, something in the quality of the quiet, the particular way a familiar place feels when something about it has changed and you are still in the process of identifying what. She went up the porch steps and through the front door. Living room empty, kitchen empty, first aid kit still open on the counter, two cold coffee mugs on the table, the wall phone in its cradle. She went through the hallway, through the utility room out the back door. Colette sat on the back porch steps with a blanket around her shoulders, looking out over the dark backfields. Alone. "Where is my father?" Riley said. She kept her voice flat and even, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she needed Colette to be able to give her information without managing Riley's reaction at the same time. Colette turned. "About 40 minutes after you left," she said, "three men came through the east drainage ditch. On foot. They knew the property well enough to know there was an undercrossing at the east fence line that the road watch wouldn't see." She paused. "Dale went to check the cattle water at 1:10 past. He did not come back. My men tracked them northeast toward the county line, but lost the trail at the gravel road past the Fielding property." Riley stood very still on the back porch in the cold. "They weren't following the tracker," Colette said, anticipating the question. "The tracker told them the ATV hadn't moved, which meant someone was still here. They didn't want the ATV. They wanted a person they could use." Riley turned and went back through the house. Colt was around the corner of the barn when she came off the front porch. He read her face before she said anything. "Tell me," he said. She told him. 40 seconds. Every piece of information Colette had given her in order. Colt looked at her for a moment. Then he turned and said a name. Briggs materialized from near the equipment shed as if he had been there all along, which he probably had. The three of them stood in the farmyard while Colt relayed what Riley had told him, and Briggs listened with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance running calculations. "The quarry," Briggs said. "Yes," Colt said. "Insurance policy," Briggs said. "Someone was watching this farm while we were staged here. Saw the size of what arrived. Understood that the quarry was vulnerable. They extracted a contingency. They couldn't have moved him far," Riley said, working through it as she spoke. "On foot in that window, dragging a man who wasn't cooperating." She stopped. "The quarry. He was already there when we were standing at the rim," she said. The arithmetic arrived quietly with the quality of an answer that had been waiting to be reached. Her father had been in that quarry in the shadow outside the work light's reach, while she had been watching Colt cross the floor to Pruitt. Colt was watching her carefully. "The FBI window," she said. "How long from the call?" 2 hours, he said. "How long ago was the call?" He checked his watch. 53 minutes. Just over an hour. The federal task force was already moving closing distance on the quarry at highway speed. Whatever the quarry held was going to be inside a federal crime scene perimeter in just over an hour. "We need to go back," she said. Colt was quiet for a moment. "When we left, everything in that quarry was secured, including anyone brought in afterward." Riley stopped herself from saying the first thing that came to mind. She started again. "They brought him in as leverage for a scenario where things went wrong," she said. "Things went wrong. They are sitting in a quarry waiting for federal agents, and my father is somewhere in that quarry, and I need to know where he is before the perimeter closes." Colt held her gaze. "The strike team is dispersed. Reassembling takes time we don't have." "I know," Riley said. "I'm not asking for the strike team." She waited. Colt turned to Briggs. "Take the farm," he said. "Stage everyone for departure. Rolling by 5:30. Briggs moved. Colt looked at Riley. "You and me," he said. "Fast." They took the county road this time, dark and fast. Riley reading the road's gentle curves by the feel of the asphalt and the spacing of the fence posts and the way the sky lightened slightly above the gaps in the tree breaks. 11 minutes. Colt cut the engine a quarter-mile from the quarry entrance, and they rolled to a stop in the shadow of the tree line. The faint, diffuse glow of the work lights was still visible above the rim. No federal vehicles yet. They went on foot along the rim, staying in the trees, working around to the southwest where the ramp descended. At the ramp's head, Riley looked down. The scene had changed since they left. The cartel men in Pruitt were where Rook's detail had left them secured wrists and ankles positioned against the crusher platform and the wheel wells of the SUVs. The transport truck was undisturbed. The work lights were burning. But there were now 8 figures instead of 7. Against the far wall of the quarry at the outer edge of the work light's reach, a man sat on the ground with his back to the limestone. His hands were bound behind him around one of the old iron conduit pipes that ran along the quarry wall at hip height, utility piping from the quarry's operational era bolted into the stone. He was upright, he was alive. He was watching the quarry floor with the focused, deliberate attention of a man managing his own fear by committing every available unit of his attention to observing his environment. Dale Ward, 52 years old, wearing the flannel shirt and work boots he'd had on when Riley came through the back door 7 hours ago. Riley felt something move through her that she did not name. It began below the sternum and moved outward through her chest, and she held it inside the same discipline she had seen her mother apply to pain and her father apply to grief, and Colette Hargrove apply to whatever a person accumulates over 68 years of living the life she had lived. She held it and breathed through it and looked at the geometry of what lay between her and her father. Dale was at the far end of the quarry from the ramp. Between them, the secured cartel men, the 3 SUVs, the transport truck, the open floor of the bowl. The work lights covered the center of the operation, which put Dale at the edge of their reach in partial shadow, visible, but not fully illuminated. The secured cartel men were watching Dale. They could see him, and they could see the ramp. If someone came down the ramp openly, those men would react, would shout, would attempt to interfere through noise and attention, even without the ability to physically act. They were contained but not removed from the situation. One of the secured men, the heavy-set man closest to the crusher, said something in a low voice. The cartel boss in the light jacket, wrists bound in front of him, now turned his head toward Dale and then toward the ramp. He said clearly in English, "The old man stays with us or he doesn't leave. Whoever is up there, hear that." Riley looked at the quarry walls. Limestone 60 feet. Cut with the horizontal shelf lines that the extraction process leaves rough ledges at intervals up the stone face. Not a staircase, not a designed climbing route, but on the southwest face in the deep shadow away from the work lights, the rock had fractured along a diagonal line in the way that limestone fractures along planes of structural weakness, creating a rough, broken progression from the rim to the floor that was not designed and was not maintained and was not anything a sensible person would choose under ordinary circumstances. Riley had been in this quarry 3 times. She had looked at that southwest face each time and thought the same thing: a person with good hands and enough nerve and no option that was better could work their way down it. She had never had that option be the best one available. Until now. She pointed at the southwest face without speaking, just her finger indicating the fault line and the shadow that covered it completely from the angle of the work lights. Colt looked at it. He looked at the distance. He looked at Riley. She held his gaze. He exhaled once through his nose. Then he pointed to himself, pointed to the ramp. Clear. He would go down the ramp, openly drawing the attention of every eye in the quarry to the north end of the bowl, away from the southwest face, in the shadow where Riley would be working her way down 60 feet of broken limestone in the dark. Riley nodded. She moved along the rim and the tree line until she was above the southwest face. She could hear distantly the sound of Colt's boots beginning their descent on the gravel ramp. She found the top of the diagonal fault line and sat on the rim edge and swung her legs over. The first 10 feet were the most technically demanding. The fault line was angled and narrow, and the first shelf was barely 8 inches of rough stone, and she had to commit her full weight to it before she could see whether it would hold what she was asking it to hold. It held. She moved to the next section by feel and by the diffuse information the work lights gave her from below, testing each placement before trusting it, maintaining 3 points of contact, moving without pausing, because pausing gave her mind permission to calculate the distance to the floor, and calculating that distance was not information she needed. She could hear Colt's voice on the quarry floor below, low, controlled, unrevealing. A voice that could be maintaining any conversation. She didn't process the words. She processed the stone. 30 feet down the fault line opened into a shelf wide enough to stand on. She stood on it and breathed and looked sideways across the quarry wall. Below her and to her left, Dale was visible in the partial shadow. His head turned toward the north end of the quarry, where Colt's voice was coming from, watching what was happening there. He had not looked in her direction, neither had anyone else. The lower 30 feet were steeper. The shelves were irregular in width, and the stone was wet in places where moisture seeped through the limestone, in the way that limestone always eventually lets water through. She moved through it in sections, making each commitment cleanly, not revisiting. At 15 feet, she slipped her left boot, skidded on a wet shelf edge, and her weight dropped suddenly, and her right hand caught a knob of protruding stone and held. And she hung there for 2 seconds that contained a very clear and vivid understanding of the distance between her current position and the quarry floor. And then she found her footing and continued. She reached the bottom in the deep shadow of the southwest corner, 30 feet from her father. The space between them was dark outside the work light's reach. She crossed it in 15 seconds, staying low, staying in the shadow. She came around the conduit pipe housing and went to her knees beside Dale. He turned his head. The expression on his face was not relief. It was something more specific than relief and considerably more complicated, the expression of a father who is genuinely surprised not by the fact that his daughter came, but by the particular terms of her arrival, the form it took and what that form said about the person she had been becoming in the years when he had been present, but perhaps not fully attending. She worked the knife from its sheath and cut the zip ties with steady, careful strokes. She caught his arms as they came free and held them while the circulation began returning, because she knew that process hurt, and she knew with equal certainty that he would not make a sound about it. He rolled his wrists. He looked at her. She pointed up, pointed at the quarry wall. He followed her finger to the fault line in the shadow. She watched him run the same calculations she had run 60 feet of broken limestone in the dark, without equipment, with stiffened wrists. She watched him arrive at the same conclusion she had arrived at, which was that it was the available option that didn't require crossing 40 feet of lit quarry floor under the eye line of secured men who would make noise even without the ability to physically act. He nodded. They climbed together. Riley went first, setting the route, testing each hold before trusting it, stopping at each adequate shelf to turn back and help Dale position his hands and feet. He was not a young man, and the binding had left his wrists with limited flexibility, but he was strong in the specific, durable way of people who have done hard physical work for decades and continued doing it past the age when most people stop. He moved carefully without rushing. He did not look down. She watched him not look down and understood it as one of the quieter forms of courage she had witnessed in her life. At the wide shelf 30 feet up, she pulled him beside her, and they stood with their backs to the limestone and breathed. Below them, the quarry floor was fully visible. The work light still burning, Colt visible near the crusher platform, with his arms crossed and his back to the ramp, conducting whatever conversation he was conducting with the patient ease of someone who has all the time available that exists. He glanced upward once. In the darkness and distance, she couldn't see his face clearly, but felt the glance land, felt him register their position on the wall, and watched him turn back to the floor with unchanged posture. The upper 30 feet in 8 minutes. At the rim, Riley went over first and reached back and took her father's forearm and pulled, and he came over the edge, and they sat together in the dead grass at the quarry rim in the cold and darkness, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Dale said quietly, "You climbed down that wall." Riley said, "Seemed like the right call." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother would have done exactly the same thing." She had not expected that. She didn't respond immediately because she didn't have an immediate response. The words settled into her chest in a place that didn't have language mapped to it yet. She held them there and breathed the cold air and knew she would be returning to them for a long time. They came off the rim and through the trees to where Colt was waiting at the motorcycle. He had come up the ramp while they were on the upper wall, timing it correctly, leaving the quarry floor exactly as it needed to be found, contained evidence, waiting for the people whose job it was to process it. When he saw Dale walking out of the trees beside Riley, something moved briefly across his face before his habitual composure settled back. He looked at Riley. She met the look. He started the motorcycle. They were back at the Ward farm before 4:30. The pre-dawn gray was just beginning at the horizon when they came down the service lane, and in that first pale light, the farm looked different to Riley in a way she couldn't precisely articulate. Nothing physical had changed. The porch still sagged, the barn roof still wore its blue tarp, the fields were still bare and waiting. But the way she was seeing it had shifted by some small degree that felt already permanent. Colette was on the front porch when they came in. She saw Dale. She held his gaze for a moment and then nodded once, the specific nod of someone who asked a question without speaking and received the answer they were waiting for. Dale nodded back. He went inside and filled the kettle and set it on the burner, the sound of a man reasserting the rhythms of his own house, because those rhythms were how he knew where he was. Riley sat on the porch steps. Colette sat in the porch chair above her. The October dark thinned at its edges. Somewhere out in the harvested fields, a bird tested a few notes against the silence and then stopped. "You went back down for him," Colette said. "Southwest face," Riley said. "There's a diagonal fault line." She paused. "I've been looking at it for years and thinking it was possible." Colette was quiet for a moment. "Then you thought about it instead of deciding it wasn't worth thinking about. That's the whole thing right there." Riley looked out over the bare fields. She thought about what Colette had said at 2 in the morning in the living room about the impulse and the reason not to act, and the way most people chose the reason. She thought about her mother at the creek bed in the evenings. She thought about her grandfather Earl signing a piece of paper in 1987 that she hadn't known existed. By 5 o'clock, the departure was underway. 2,000 riders organizing themselves with the same quiet efficiency they had applied to their arrival bikes coming off the fields. In sequence access roads, clearing the column, forming on the county road, with the practice choreography of people who had done this before in other places, after other things that needed doing. No ceremony, no prolonged leave-taking. They had come because they were called. They had done what needed doing. The work was finished. Briggs came to the porch and spoke briefly to Colt Logistics routing timing to avoid the county road that the federal convoy would be using. Colt listened and nodded once. Colt stood at the base of the porch steps and looked up at Riley. "You put 300 men in the right place," he said, "through terrain that exists on no map. And then you went back down a 60-foot limestone wall to get your father out before the federal perimeter closed." He said it as a plain account of events, not a performance of admiration. Just what had happened, stated accurately. Riley reached into her breast pocket and held out the silver ring. Colt shook his head. "Keep it," he said. "You've earned the right to return it in person when the time comes." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he put on his sunglasses in the pre-dawn dark, which she suspected had more to do with habit than the light conditions, and walked to his motorcycle. By 6 o'clock, the Ward farm was empty of everything except what had always belonged there. No trace of occupation remained. The fields were undamaged. The access lanes were clear. The farmyard was as it had been the morning before. If you had driven past on the county road at 6:15, you would have seen a working farm in the quiet of an October dawn, and you would have had no way of knowing what had passed through it in the previous 24 hours. That was, Riley thought, exactly as it should be. Dale and Riley sat at the kitchen table and drank fresh coffee. The local radio, just after 6:30, carried the first report with the slightly stunned quality of a broadcaster who has been handed information that doesn't fit his mental model of his own county. A major law enforcement operation at an abandoned quarry in northern Mahaska County, joint FBI and DEA task force. Multiple arrests, a substantial narcotic seizure. And the name Denton Pruitt delivered in the careful tone of someone saying aloud something they are still in the process of believing. Dale turned the volume down. He sat with his coffee and looked at his hands for a moment, at the fading marks on his wrists. "You're going to want to fix that porch support this week," Riley said. Dale looked up. "Before the ground freezes," she said. If it goes another winter, the whole left corner is going to drop. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man receiving something he hadn't anticipated, and then arriving at what it was, not deflection, not avoidance, but restoration. The language they had always used with each other, the language of work and weather, and the specific ongoing requirements of a piece of land that needed constant tending. She was returning them to that language, and he understood why, and he understood it was the right thing. I know, he said, I'll get the lumber Tuesday. They sat with that for a while. 1 week later, on a Tuesday morning while Dale was at the lumberyard in Oskaloosa, a black Mercedes sedan turned off the county road and came down the Ward driveway with the unhurried deliberateness of a vehicle that knows exactly where it is going. A man in a charcoal suit climbed out carrying a flat leather portfolio. He was in his mid-40s, trim, precise, the specific kind of attorney who works for clients whose affairs require both absolute competence and absolute discretion, and who has found over years of practice that the two requirements are not in conflict. He asked for Riley Ward. She came off the tractor and met him at the porch steps. He opened the portfolio and produced a thick envelope and handed it to her without preamble or explanation. She opened it. The first document was the mortgage. First Mahaska bank account number she knew by heart because she had been looking at it on bank statements since she was 14 years old. Across its face in red ink, a stamped notation paid in full, dated 4 days ago. She looked through the remaining documents methodically. A letter from the bank confirming the payoff and the release of all liens. A clean title to the property, all 500 acres, every parcel, no encumbrances of any kind. At the bottom of the envelope, her fingers found something that was not paper. She pulled it out. An old document, brittle at the fold lines, the ink faded from black to brown with age. A handwritten receipt dated October 1987, signed at the bottom in 2 different hands in 2 different inks. A loan of $12,000 made between Raymond Hargrove and Earl Ward for the purchase of the eastern 200 acres of the Ward farm. The terms were set out in Earl's careful block capital printing. The repayment was marked as completed in 1994, signed off in Raymond Hargrove's hand. Below Raymond's signature, added much later in a different hand, feminine. Precise, the handwriting of someone accustomed to writing things that were meant to endure a single line. This debt was honored. The land it built is good land. C.H. Riley stood on the porch of the farmhouse her grandfather had built on ground that his generation had broken, and held the paper that connected her family to a woman she had met 6 days ago in the dark at the edge of a cornfield. She thought about Earl Ward, whom she had known only as an old man with rough hands and very specific opinions about soil drainage and the proper way to maintain a fence line. She thought about Raymond Hargrove, whom she had never known and would never know, but who had signed his name next to her grandfather's, and whose widow had kept that signature safe for 30 years, not as a claim, but as a memory. She thought about what Colette had said on the back porch in the early morning dark. You thought about it instead of deciding it wasn't worth thinking about. The attorney was waiting. There is also this, he said, and produced from his breast pocket a small object wrapped in a square of clean cloth. He placed it in her hand and walked back to his car without additional conversation. The Mercedes turned in the driveway and moved back toward the county road and disappeared. Riley unwrapped the cloth. A gold coin heavy in the palm, the diameter of a silver dollar but denser, the weight of something made to last. On one face, the death's head, the winged skull and its motorcycle helmet rendered in precise relief, made with specific intention and not mass-produced. On the reverse, 2 lines of small, clean capital letters. Blood makes you related. Loyalty makes you family. Riley held the coin in her right hand and the 1987 receipt in her left, and stood on the porch of her family's farm in the October morning light, the field stretching away to the tree lines in every direction, bare now and resting, waiting for whatever the next season would ask of them. The sky was clear. The light was the particular clean light of late October in Iowa, low-angled and honest, the light that shows things as they are, without flattering them. She did not feel like a 19-year-old farm girl who had stumbled into something that exceeded her. She felt for the first time since her mother had died in the spring of her 14th year that the land under her feet was fully and unambiguously hers. Not a burden she was managing by an act of constant will, not a debt she was servicing, not a thing she was holding together through habit and stubbornness while it slowly ground her down. Hers, earned. The way her grandfather had earned it with work and with honesty and with the willingness to act when action was required and not to look away from the thing that needed to be faced. Dale's truck came back down the county road at 10:30. It turned into the driveway and pulled up to the barn, and Dale climbed out and went directly to the truck bed and started unloading lumber the way he always did work first. Everything arranged and accounted for before anything else. He didn't look toward the house immediately. That was his way. Riley put the coin and the receipt in her jacket pocket and walked across the yard to help him. She would tell him about the envelope at lunch. She would show him the mortgage with its red stamp and the clean title and the 1987 receipt with Raymond Hargrove's signature and her grandfather's block printing and Colette's single line at the bottom. She would watch his face move through whatever it moved through when he read those words, and she would give him the room to do that privately without her watching. But right now, there was lumber to carry and a porch support to fix before the ground froze solid, and the morning was clear and cold, and the light was good, and the work was straightforward, and there was no reason at all to wait.